32 of them involved the use of a specially converted van. This enabled the chemical compound to be sprayed secretly out of a vent in the roof.
The main thing with the Cardington trials was the amount of experiments that were carried out per day. Sometimes, the minimum I think was 4, and then the maximum was 6 on some days. So many trials were done on the same day. The quantities were huge. In fact, Porton Down sprayed in one series of trials in one day. They sprayed so much that all the trials results merged together. They couldn't tell the individual trials apart. Scientists who were actually providing the source, they were completely protected against this substance. Yet, a few yards away from the van, there were people walking around totally unprotected. It sounds dramatic, but there would have been newborn babies in prams, there would have been young children, there would have been old people, there would have been people with asthma. If you lived next to that route, you were really taking in quite a large dosage over a very small period of time.
And now that you know a van drove around the village lane spraying cadmium, does that horrify you?
It does horrify me, yeah, especially where the children are involved as well, and the idea of spraying different villages, through roads in different villages, is absolutely abhorrent, as far as I'm concerned. It should never have happened.
This lack of thoroughness by Porton Down caused a problem for the Labour government in 1999. Fearful of inheriting something damaging from the past, they ordered a review into whether there were any health risks from the trials. The inquiry was led by a medical professor from Cambridge.
The Ministry of Defence invited the Academy of Medical Sciences to review the evidence after it became public knowledge that these trials had taken place. Between 53 and 64, it became public knowledge they had been taking place, concern was expressed, and they wanted an independent scientific body to go over the evidence and advise whether anybody is likely to have come to any harm.
And what did you conclude? What did you deduce from the evidence?
We looked at all the evidence that was available to us, and we came to the conclusion that no one is likely to have suffered any harm from the amounts of zinc cadmium sulfide they might have encountered even in a worst case scenario during this period. The amount of cadmium we're exposed to anyway, which is released by industry into the atmosphere, is very much greater than anyone was exposed to from this, even those who were in the areas who were maximally exposed.
InsideOut has discovered that the Lachman inquiry didn't take into account any of the ground level trials done at Cardington. Some of the national records weren't available to Professor Lachman at the time. We have now seen the missing documents, and these show that there were more trials, but they were never officially reported.
We do not have detailed accounts of the land release at Cardington. We have them from Bewley, but you've just shown me some figures, and the highest figures at Bewley were much higher. So the calculations made at Bewley are more pessimistic than those would be made from the figures you've just shown me.
The scientists in the back of the lorry were dressed in full protective clothing, yet just a few feet away in the villages the lorry passed through, people would have been exposed to quite a lot, wouldn't they?
I do not know the details of exactly how this was done. I don't suppose they did it in built-up areas. I don't imagine they did it where there were people about. But I don't know. And you may have more descriptions of that, since this particular document wasn't available to us at that time. We weren't asked to consider whether this was an efficient way of predicting biological warfare. But if you ask me just as an uninformed observer, I think this was actually a very sensible way of doing it. And they were very similar to the trials that were done in the United States at the same time.
So what is safe exposure to a poison? In the States, the trials in the 1950s and 60s were more openly known about, and there were people prepared to speak out against toxic spraying in public places. An environmental professor, Art Spomer, became concerned about the deliberate exposure of cadmium to humans. Professor Spomer told his superiors about the potential risks of open-air spraying, but initially he was ignored. It was only when he published a scientific article that anyone took any notice. Spomer's article was based on medical research into cadmium poisoning done as early as the 1930s. It was known then that cadmium entering the human body in any dosage or concentration was harmful to health. Inside Out tracked him down to his home in Illinois, and he agreed to talk to us.
Professor Spomer, do you still stand by what you wrote about the effects of inhaling cadmium?
Yeah, I don't think anything has changed since that. I'm not a medical person, and I don't directly follow that literature, but I don't think anything's changed.
Do you think the fluorescent particle trials should have ever taken place in the UK?
I have no idea why they did them, because they had better ways to study what they were trying to find out. And so I'm not quite sure why they... I think it was an unnecessary hazard to expose people to this material, whether they knew it was toxic or not. Although, again, they should have known cadmium. Cadmium is known for a long time to be toxic.
Should zinc cadmium ever be inhaled or ingested into the body?
No, not intentionally. Yeah, no.
Well, I think the main issue, as far as we're concerned, was the frequency as to how many times this was done. And this van went round the village lanes and sprayed sometimes 5-6 times a day from the top of the van.
Oh my God! Yeah, well, it's stupid science. If in this case if they had some knowledge of the toxicity of the material, it's probably criminal.
There just isn't any evidence, and it isn't that people haven't looked. So, I mean, he can say what he likes. Until he produces some evidence to the contrary, this is typical of a particular kind of argument to raise anxiety.
It's worrying that Professor Lackman has not seen all the evidence. I mean, that raises the question of whether or not the Ministry of Defence should carry out a new inquiry.
Coming up, the last attempt to make the trials effective and the legacy that won't go away.
He was effectively lying to me to cover up what he was doing.
Porton Down and the Ministry of Defence have stated that trials would happen again if there was this military need.
By late 1963, the trials were stepped up a notch when Norwich was chosen for nighttime experiments. The circular, contained nature of the city and the relatively flat surrounding area provided the ideal conditions for spraying an unsuspecting population with this toxic substance. By this time, all previous experiments with cadmium sulfide spraying had failed, and a last-ditch effort to get effective results was to take place in Norwich. Porton Down staked everything on their success. The Home Office was involved, and so too were the City of Norwich Police, although officers on the ground were ignorant of the details.
I was approached at my house by a gentleman who said that he was monitoring or recording the pollution from the traffic. He was a man about 45, average build, and wearing a long dark coat and a trilby. He then produced this box type thing to put in the garden. His instructions were, don't interfere with it. He said, we will check this from time to time. I just thought it was a delicate piece of machinery to monitor the pollution from the traffic.
What the man from the ministry put in Stan Wilson's garden was a device for detecting zinc cadmium sulfide released into the atmosphere.
If somebody had asked me what the apparatus was in my garden for, I would have told them exactly what I'd been told. It was for the traffic pollution. By him telling me all this, I was perpetuating a lie to anybody else who was inquiring about it. I feel completely disgusted that they should have used this cadmium sulfide when they knew that it was a very dangerous poison.
No one was to know. As we now know, police officers were involved. They were not told.